Welcome back to the Community Action Podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Jamie Carney, and here with me is Gail Lombardi and Jesse Quintana. We are family coaches and facilitators for the Future Story Initiative. The Future Story Initiative is a place where community members can receive information and support while exiting poverty. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about poverty, and talking about poverty can be a tough thing to do. But here at Community Action, we are committed to working together to end poverty in our community.
What is poverty?
Poverty is living without resources to meet your everyday needs, basic needs.
That's right.
Not just funds, but resources and everyday.
I think it's worth it to point out to everybody listening to the conversation, because I think so many of us, when we think of the word poverty, we think of financial resources, we think of money, and we think that poverty is only a lack of money.
Right.
And not a lack of resources.
Right. And if
right?
I win the lottery,
if I just had enough money, I wouldn't be in poverty, right?
Right.
And so we wanted to clear up any confusion about, so today we're really going to talk about what is poverty. Like, what does that mean when we say the word poverty? What does the government define that as? And then, like, what are some of the ways to get out of poverty? Like, what are some of the benefits of poverty?
Yeah.
Like, we just want to have a nice conversation about poverty. We don't want it to be a downer. We know that the subject sometimes can be very difficult to talk about, but it's really important to talk about because this is something that we're passionate about, and us as Community Action, this is what our role is in our community.
Yes. That's good.
In our community, we come across two types of poverty: generational poverty and situational poverty. And in situational poverty, you as an individual or a family have run across a situation that's put you in poverty. That could be something like a divorce. Maybe you've become disabled. Maybe drugs are involved in your life. So this is a situation that's happened that kind of put you into poverty. Now, generational poverty is going to be a little bit different. Generational poverty is where a family has been in poverty for 2 or more generations.
And that's why it's important in community action that we talk about that, because if we break the cycle of it, then have situational poverty, then we don't have the generational. We can prevent that and have success stories.
Right. Generational poverty can be like a cultural thing, right?
Yes.
Like, it's normal for your family to be in poverty, and that's what's expected, and what is the norm.
This is what we've always done, and generational can even affect somebody that wants to get out of poverty. Like, I want more than to live off assistance, and so I want to go to college. And you might have a sibling or a relative that's saying, "Oh no, this is how it is," and we just hit our bootstraps and we do it. No, you're not better than us. What do you think you are? I've run into that quite a bit about people really have a desire to succeed, but that family culture of always being in poverty. This is how it is. This is how we work. And so,
right, because that's what's comfortable, right?
That's what's
right.
Yep.
Gotcha. And we're not saying that there is something wrong with being in poverty either.
No.
We just want to have a conversation about poverty.
Well, I think let's be honest. All of us the three of us we've been there, done that. So it's not like something we haven't experienced and might experience it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and different forms of it.
Different
levels of it.
Right. So, yeah.
Working poverty. So since we're talking about poverty and we're talking about Community Action Partnership, we wanted to give you just a little bit of history about our agency and why we're talking about poverty. So our goal at Community Action Partnership is to help individuals exit poverty, to educate individuals, especially in the Future Story Initiative program. We really want to focus a little bit more on that education part, and giving people the skills and tools to have what they need to be successful.
Right.
And so where does our funding come from? How are we started? How did we get to where we're at now? And why is this important to us as an agency? So back in the 60s, Lyndon B. Johnson was president, and he was going around America, around different communities. And while he was in these communities, he had noticed that there was a lot of communities that were living in poverty. And these were really bad off areas that didn't have any resources, they didn't have any funding, and they didn't have anybody in the community who they could go to for help.
Right.
You know, it was just, this was how their lives were there in those communities. And he was really disturbed by that. So in 1964, he declared a war on poverty. And he did what was called the Economic Opportunities Act. And part of that act was finding communities and giving the poor people the voice to have change in their own community. So we want to help these communities. We want to give them an opportunity by giving them grants and money to help their community get out of poverty. And what better way to do that than to find people from that community who are going to decide what was best used in that community.
In that particular, because it's going to be
Right,
different
'cause,
everywhere you're at. Yeah.
you know, what San Francisco may need might be different than what Lewis and Idaho needs, right?
Right.
So it's different in every community. And that is one of the great things that they did back then is they recognized that every community is different. Therefore, how they use the funding is different. And they gave them the choice that, hey, we're going to give you the funding and then you can determine what is the best need for that in your community. And that is kind of basically how community actions were started.
Right. That's good.
And there is, I don't know how many there is total, over 1,000 here in the U.S. And we're very proud to be working for ours here in Lewiston.
And we can do a little pat on the back. I think we're one of the, if not the only one of the community actions that serves two states.
We serve two states, correct. Yeah.
And so that's kind of makes it interesting and makes it fun.
Right. So one of the things that we also wanted to touch on today, since we're talking about poverty, is what is poverty? Like, we know what poverty means as far as not having the resources to meet basic needs, but what does that mean? How do you define that? How does the government define that? And who determines what that monetary amount is when
Right.
it becomes to benefits,
Right.
and then how much you need to make versus what you can make to get help. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happened, because I think that there's a lot of confusion out there when people look at the numbers of how the government defines poverty, and then you look at the cost of living today.
Right.
And sometimes we get the question of, how is it that I can only make that much and not get any help because I need help? However, you're telling me I can only make this much. And so we have to explain to them that we aren't the ones that make up the rules. The government defines those numbers, and some of those numbers are a little outdated, but it's very important. We don't want to sugarcoat things. We want to be real in what those numbers are,
Right.
so people can understand and be prepared for, how do I get from point A to point B without falling into this gray area where I'm technically poor. However, the government doesn't define me as poor.
Right.
Right.
And how to successfully move on without hitting any walls.
Right.
Yeah.
Without going through as many barriers as possible. Right.
Right.
So how does the government come up with those numbers? Right. So back in the 60s, there was a lady named Molly Orshansky. She worked for the Social Security Department. And she was the one who was tasked with coming up, kind of creating these numbers and coming up with these numbers. She's known for it now. If you don't know anything about her, I suggest you do some research on her. She's kind of an amazing woman, especially a woman in the 60s
Right.
who was able to accomplish the things that she
Yes.
did. And so she was tasked with trying to figure out, how do we define poverty? What's the numbers that we can come up with that determines this family's in poverty and this family's not? So Molly Orshansky actually used to work for the USDA as well. And she worked for the USDA for quite a while, so she was very familiar with the USDA food plans. Now, the USDA kind of is, they're the ones that come up with like how much nutrition you should have daily, what your caloric intake should be, and coming up with a plan for like what you would need for a one-person family, two-person family, if you have children in the family, etc.
Right.
So they had these food plans back then as well. And Molly had worked for this company, not making the food plans, but she was very familiar, so she worked with them. So she knew that there was food plans. And also what she did was, there was 4 different food plans, which is still the same today. there's the liberal food plan, which is like the highest food plan you can get, which is like if you're really eating really good and you're getting all that healthy stuff and the best, Then there was the moderate food plan, and then there was the low cost food plan. And then there was one underneath that was called the economy food plan, which is basically like an emergency food plan, Now it's known as the thrifty food plan, but this was like the lowest cost food plan you can have, like just what you need nutritionally to survive, and not something that's meant to be like a long-term food plan.
Right.
So Molly took these numbers. She did some research, and she took some research back in the 50s, actually 1955. And she looked at the budget of Americans and what they were spending most of their money on. And she determined that food was one of the biggest expenses back in the 50s, where everything else wasn't as much. And she determined that food made up for about 30% or a third of a person's income back in the 50s. So what she did was she took the economy plan from the USDA food plan, times that by 3, because that was what you spent most of your money on back then.
Right.
That was a third of your income. And that's how they developed the poverty guidelines. So it was based off of a food plan, food cost times 3, and that's what you came up with. The problem with that nowadays is food isn't the majority expense nowadays. Now you may have housing costs, which are becoming astronomical, childcare costs, healthcare costs.
In the 60s, women didn't work. So now you have the child care expense.
Right, right. And also, like, I think in the 60s, things like mandatory health insurance weren't a thing.
Auto insurance.
Car insurance was only, in some states was mandatory, but in most it wasn't. So there's certain things nowadays that we have that they didn't have then. Also, one of the things to realize is this. These numbers are based on gross income. These do not account for taxes either.
Right.
So there's a big disparity between looking at the numbers and then saying, wait a minute, like I can only make that much.
Right.
And so then we get individuals that come in and say, hey, I'm barely making any money. I'm paying this, I'm paying that, I'm paying this, and I have no money left over for food. How am I supposed to afford food? And you say, I'm sorry, but we're also regulated by what we can, and it's unfortunate, but we want people to know what those numbers are. So if you're not familiar with what they are, I would suggest that you go on to the government's website and look at what the numbers are so because we want people to be prepared. And that's why we're talking about this today. We're not talking about this for it to be gloomy or down and to say like, oh, there's no hope. What we're trying to do is we want people to be aware of what those numbers are so they can prepare and plan for them, right?
Yeah, that's how we get our success stories, is when we look at it realistically from here to here, and then let's look at what you need to do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can say, you can sugarcoat things and make it seem like it's something else. But the best way that we feel that you can help somebody is just by being real with them and then giving them the black and white numbers and saying, this is what we have, and this is where we need to get to. How do we get from point A to point B, and let's work with you and make this happen.
Right. Having those difficult conversations that are real and successful.
Right.
So I heard you say point A to point B, and kind of hitting that gap to where you're no longer receiving services and still needing help.
Right.
Correct.
So when we are in our workshops, we talk about the financial cliff. Mm-hmm. The financial cliff is something that, exactly demonstrates that, where you're going to have that gap where if you are somebody that is lower income and is receiving benefits, something we call spending power, then if you start to make those changes and exit poverty, then you start losing those benefits. What kind of benefits can you use as a spending power?
Well, you have childcare for one, which is a massive benefit nowadays because they can be, you could be paying $800 for one child at daycare, depending on the age. And
another one is when you get that $2 raise and you think you're going to make it, then all of a sudden they cut back on your food stamps.
Food stamps.
So
food stamps,
another resource would be looking at your food banks and how that works. maybe even taking a cooking class to learn how to do from Staples. But there's options out there.
I know here at Community Action, we help with utility assistance. And so that could be a benefit and
There's
a spending
Medicaid.
power. Medicaid, earned income, of course, you mentioned getting raises. And so these are all things that we
There's also
call,
housing vouchers and things like that help out as well.
absolutely. And so those are all things that are going to be contribute to spending power. Now, again, if you start getting your raise and increasing your income, then those benefits that are received from the state may go down. And if that happens, how do you plan to get from point A to point B, like you said, Jesse, without being in that gap and being off in a worse situation?
Right, because they might not just go down, they may go off completely.
Right.
And you may just be stuck like, now I have to figure out how I'm going to afford to pay all this stuff when I thought I was getting a $2 raise and I was going to be so much better off. And now I'm struggling to pay my bills and I'm having to cut buying food because I have to pay my rent, and I'm going to cut my electric bill because I have to pay for my car insurance.
People go without
And then
medication because
you're worse
yeah.
off than you were before.
Right.
And that's an area that we don't want to see people be in. And it's an area that we have experienced ourselves. So we have to determine what is the amount that we need to make that we can comfortably live on and be able to pay all of our needs, you know?
Well, and that's what we do as financial coaches is we look at, okay, this is what you're going to gain. This is what you're going to do. Let's do a budget. Because if you don't plan, one of the things we run into is I've got a check on the 5th and the 20th, but my bill doesn't come until the 15th. So I've already spent that check on the 5th. And so when it comes to it, so if you look at your budget and say, okay, I need to keep this much back. And that's really when you get that $2 raise and you want to do something special. But realistically, in order to not keep coming back, we don't want to enable people. We want to strengthen them and support them and say, hey, realistically, you can do this. Let's look at the budget. You can still have fun. You can still enjoy your family, but let's get you in a better place. And so budgeting is really important when it comes to
Yeah.
coaching.
Keeping an eye on those numbers that the government is giving those income guidelines, and if that raise, how much is that raise going to lift you to
Right.
that guideline? Absolutely, keeping an eye on that. They also say that it can take 4 years, sometimes more, to get from point A to point B, and so a plan to get there while you still do have those benefits is going to be key to exiting poverty without hitting that gap.
Right.
That could be things like getting some training, education, going to college and getting a degree to where you're making a lower wage or not having that wage and getting that education. So when you do go out into the workforce or change your job, you're going to have that higher wage and jump right over that gap.
Right. Miss the gap altogether. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
Jesse, you talked about, well, we defined poverty as not having enough resources. If you're increasing your resources, that can help you get across poverty. Maybe you had mentioned not receiving a child care subsidy anymore. Maybe you have developed a relationship with a family member or a friend who could instead watch your children for you at a lower or no cost rate. And so building resources, people you know, can help your situation as well.
I know when I was a single mother, I had a girlfriend that worked during the day. And so she would watch my children. And then I had an evening job. And so she would, and so there was actually no cost, and it worked out really well. And but looking at that, I think one of the other things that we need to be realistic about is some individuals that are in fixed incomes have trouble looking at this as resources instead of help because they've worked all their life and they're on a fixed income now, and all of a sudden they can't meet their bills. And so how to encourage them to use these resources, and that it's not a stigmatization. Where you are financially is not who you are in real life. So that's something that needs to be addressed.
I think that's a good point to, sit back and what is your plan? What is your story? Who's telling your story? Are you the one developing that plan and that story? And really, how are you going to make it to where you want to be?
Right. I think part of that is we want to be clear about benefits, that they're there to help people who need them. People that have a disability or people that have an unfortunate situation that happens and they're stuck in this situation where they need assistance. Benefits are not meant to be lived on forever.
Right.
What we're trying to do is just have an understanding of, we understand that people are going to need help sometimes, and that's what we're here for. We want to get you from an area of being dependent on benefits to an area of being self-sufficient and giving you the power to be successful in your own
Right.
life,
Right.
And I think that's part of the reason where people run into where they don't want to ask for help because they feel like they're being like mooches or something
Right.
like that, when that's not the case. It's there for a reason, and it's there to help people that need it.
I think that part of that this is my theory, okay? I think part of that segmentation is, way back when, if you come to the United States and you work really hard, you're going to be a success. So if I'm busting my tail and I still can't feed my children or I can't get my car fixed, then I must be a failure.
Then you're
It
a
has
failure.
nothing to do with that. It has to do with these figures that we have to work with and the realistic economy the way it is. And so using resources is a smart thing to do.
So if this kind of touched home to you and you liked what you heard today, or maybe you have a plan that you're working on or are interested in developing a plan, we're here at Community Action to help you. Please reach out to a family coach today or check out our website for more information.
And please remember that this is just, again, a brief synopsis of what we do every day, and that we enjoy having success stories of community action.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining us today. Community Action Partnership is a nonprofit organization. All the services we provide are free of charge to income qualifying community members. What we talked about today is just a bit of what we cover in our coaching and workshops. For more information, you can check out our website at cap4action.org. That's CAP, the number 4, action.org. You could also just give us a call at 1-800-326-4843 or come visit one of our locations. We would like to thank our sponsor, Optum Idaho, for making this series possible.